Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is pretty disappointing for me. I don't exactly hate it, and I even weirdly respect what it tries to do by the end of the show. I just feel like it was really misguided in trying to get there. I'm gonna be pretty harsh on the show because I'm mainly here to talk about the flaws that I haven't seen anybody really mention, but I hope that even if you disagree with my opinion, you can at least listen to my arguments for why I think it's bad and understand where I'm coming from. One of the worst aspects of the show is its sense of humor. It's super lazy for the most part, either resorting to rehashing jokes from the movie but with almost none of the energy, or this really obnoxious wouldn't it be funny mindset. Like, wouldn't it be funny if we changed Edgar Wright's name to Edgar Wrong when making a character based off of him? Wouldn't it be funny if we had Wallace and Todd start bumping uglies? Wouldn't it be funny if we had this guy hit on Ramona and giggle to himself creepily as he stares at her ass? Wouldn't it be funny if we had the characters in the show try and recreate the Scott Pilgrim movie and have other people acting for the parts of Ramona Flowers and Scott Pilgrim? Okay, that last idea is actually kind of funny, but the other three suck. Let's talk about Wallace and Todd for a bit. This joke is so clumsily set up that it only really works as a massive troll, and the reason this joke doesn't work is that it doesn't make sense for any of the characters involved. This is especially the case for Wallace. His actions don't really abide by any kind of logic or underlying motives. Prior to him suggesting to the director that they should have Todd make out with him instead of Envy, there's nothing indicating that he has a thing for Todd other than the fact that he's just gay. So why does he suggest this idea to the director? Well, it's because that would be random and funny, unless just being gay makes you this promiscuous person who wants to fuck every guy you get the chance to. There's a similar joke to this in the movie with the punchline ending and Wallace making out with Stacy's boyfriend, but the movie actually has a proper setup there. From the very beginning of the rocket sequence, Wallace makes it explicitly clear that he's got the hots for Jimmy, and throughout the entirety of the sequence, he constantly and uncomfortably probes at him, which builds to this hilarious climax where it's revealed that they've been making out for a while now. It's made even more hilarious by the implication that Wallace has done this before to Stacy's boyfriend specifically. I feel like if this anime had just set up Wallace's interest in Todd from the beginning and maybe played with that tension a bit before the big punchline, this would have been much better, but as it is now, it's just something that only relies on the absurdity of the situation. Same with that random bullshit of that guy hitting on Ramona. What was up with that? I thought that was at least going to come up again, but no, it never did. That was just fucking weird. The few jokes that actually require setup in the show, on the other hand, are brought down by their weird sense of comedic timing. I feel like this can be best exemplified by this clip here.
But we did figure out the win. I thought someone would say it! I wasn't pausing for dramatic effect.
You didn't fucking pause at all. At least she didn't come anywhere close to pausing long enough for the situation to become awkward. The second she stops talking, she instantly reacts to the silence around her, despite the fact that she hasn't given the others enough time to even react the way the scene needs them to. It doesn't get as bad as this most of the time, but you can really feel how off some of these interactions are. Like when Scott realizes that Kim was being sarcastic when referring to his life as interesting in the first episode. He doesn't get any time to truly process the tone that she says it in. As soon as he says, "Thanks, Kim," he just immediately puts together what she was really doing there. Again, there's another scene similar to this one from the movie, except there Kim literally says,
"Scott, if your life had a face, I would punch it."
Yeah. Wait, what?
It's explicit enough for Scott not to need any time to understand what she was saying. Combine that line with the way Scott accidentally agrees with it because he was just agreeing with everything the other people in the room were saying, and it makes it funny when he goes, "Wait, what?" and kind of asks her to clarify. The show also relies on these terrible references to other pieces of media. Like, it's not the fact that these references are made in the first place, it's the fact that they serve no purpose other than going, "Hey, look at this thing that we know about." For example, when Lucas makes a note about the way his character dies in the movie, he just goes, "Wow, what idiot would write this?" And that's the scene. The show instantly cuts away afterwards, and when I first watched that, I was just like, wow, that was fucking lazy. The same thing goes for that dumb Sonic the Hedgehog line in the first episode. The purpose of this line feels very much like it's just trying to make note of the fact that there were two Sonic the Hedgehog cartoons. Isn't that crazy? Other than the vague reasoning of Scott liking video games, there's no reason for him to socialize like this. I would understand if the point of this line was to show that Scott is bad at this and that the situation is awkward, and that's definitely what the scene is trying to go for, but this line definitely doesn't work in that way. For one, it actually manages to get Ramona engaged in the conversation with him, and they even find a way of relating to each other because Ramona starts talking about television in general, Columbo specifically. The only reason why the situation is awkward is because Scott is just nervous, which is completely understandable and could be done without making a dumb reference like they did. People may call me a hypocrite because once again there's a similar line like this in the movie where Scott brings up Pac-Man when trying to talk to Ramona, but that line actually succeeds at making things awkward between them because of the way Ramona responds in this completely disinterested way. There's also another purpose to it, because it shows what a giant loser Scott is by comparing how he explains it here to an earlier scene of when he explains it to Knives. Here, he doesn't have any confidence, and he immediately marks himself as a weirdo in Ramona's eyes. When he's with Knives, however, he just can't help but suck himself off and totally monopolize the conversation, only really letting her participate in their date when it comes time to pay for the arcade machine. That actually leads into one of the biggest gripes I have with the show, which is how they portray Scott in the first episode. I know the show mostly revolves around Ramona, and the first episode is more or less just a bait and switch, but Scott still plays a major role in the story, even if he's not in most of the show. A huge problem with the first episode is it constantly tries to dial back the creep and asshole factor of Scott's character. Unlike in the movies, where it's made abundantly clear by all the rational people in the cast that Scott is a fucking weirdo for going out with the 17-year-old, here the show makes note of it as little as possible, and when they actually do, they even go out of their way to say that dating is a strong word that isn't entirely accurate when describing Scott's relationship with Knives. Scott himself also seems genuinely confused as to whether or not you could even call Knives his girlfriend. So if the show doesn't make it clear that Scott is even dating Knives and doing something terribly shady, it drastically lowers his culpability in the situation and makes it so there's barely anything for him to take accountability for. Even during the scene where he's apologizing to Knives and acknowledges that he shouldn't have gone out with her in the first place, the show still manages to try and undermine Scott's responsibility by having him say that what he did is frowned upon by society and not extremely fucking questionable and creepy. This just feels so hand-wavy, like, oh no, society is the problem, not me. I feel like people are gonna argue that Scott is slightly trying to make excuses for himself in this scene, but this is supposed to be an honest reflection on his part about what he did wrong, and to have him do something like that is still a terrible way to handle this moment. I understand that it might not be the most comfortable thing for modern audiences, but the decision to change Scott from a reprehensible person to more of a lovable idiot really ends up hurting whatever message the anime tried to have. You can't really tell a story about these awful people having to come to terms with and confront how awful they are when you consistently dance around the issues of these characters. Even what they do with Ramona in this anime falls a bit flat for me because of just how easy it is for her to realize how shitty she was to all of her exes. For most of them, Ramona doesn't even actually acknowledge any of her wrongdoings, and she's just allowed to get away with this because most of her exes have either already moved on from her, or more surprisingly, they were the ones who wronged her instead of it being the other way around. Like with Matthew, he's this big CEO now, and he really doesn't show any interest in Ramona at all, meaning the show doesn't give her an opportunity to make up for how she treated him. Lucas thanks Ramona because without her doing what she did, he wouldn't have become the person he is today. Todd was only with Ramona for sexual reasons, and like Matthew, doesn't care about her anymore because he realizes his true feelings for Wallace. The twins were the ones creeping on a college freshman, and she was just trying to get back at them. And Gideon was described to be an emotionally abusive, controlling, and manipulative asshole. The only one of her exes she has to work to reconcile with is Roxy, and even in that episode, they portray these kinds of situations in a really straightforward way. Is it healthier to talk through your problems instead of fighting about them? Yes, absolutely. But does that mean you can resolve all of your problems with somebody through talking? No, I don't think so, and I think it's a little irresponsible to say otherwise. Sometimes the mistakes you make end up hurting people considerably, and to a point where you really can't make up for it. But what happens in this episode? Ramona immediately recognizes that what she did to Roxy was bad, and she apologizes. Roxy immediately accepts her apology, and after their fight, they're just on good terms again. Ironically enough, I feel like the movie had a much more mature take on this idea, since it looked at these situations in brutally honest ways. It's not really easy to acknowledge the serious flaws in yourself, and that's reflected in the way that both Scott and Ramona try to trivialize the terrible things they've done to other people. Like, take a look at this scene of Scott and Ramona talking about their past relationships and see how Ramona essentially boils down the reason why all of her evil exes are evil to a simple, that's just how it works when breaking up with somebody.
No breakup is painless. Somebody always gets hurt. What about you and that girl Knives? Who broke up with who?
I believe I broke up with her.
And then she goes on to use Scott's previous relationships with Knives and Kim as examples of that, even though those relationships are perfect instances of things ending in an unnecessarily cruel and shitty way. This scene makes it instantly clear that both of these people are terrible and they have a problem because they can't admit it. And by the end of the movie, Scott doesn't even get it right the first time around and needs a whole retry in order to fully understand just how deeply he's hurt the people who are close to him. If you like the way the anime portrayed this conflict of facing your past and acknowledging your wrongdoings, that's fine, but let me remind you that the show also kind of neuters its own point and themes in the final episode. When Scott and Ramona are reunited, they try to kiss only to find out that there's this barrier thing in the way, and they come to the conclusion that in order to get rid of it, they have to deal with all of Ramona's exes again. And this is just really strange. Why does Ramona encourage Scott to go and waste all of these people that she's basically made up with at this point? Why is she just okay with the idea of killing all of them at this point in the story, when the only thing this show has kind of been about is the idea that talking through your problems is better than fighting about them? It's not like they were planning on asking questions first and then fighting as a last resort. No, the first thing Scott does when he sees Todd is rush directly towards him to beat the shit out of him. What the hell? Just so you can make out with your boyfriend, you're okay with killing all of these people who you've come to an understanding with? I mean, imagine if there was an end credit scene in the movie where Scott wanted to cheat on Ramona with knives even though he just apologized to both of them at the end of the movie and realized that wasn't a cool thing to do. Like, that would make you go, what the fuck, right? Obviously, they don't end up fighting because that would be too clear of an indicator that these two just don't care about trying to be better people, but the intent was there on both Scott and Ramona's part, and that by itself muddies a lot of what the show is trying to go for. There are actually quite a few things that muddy what the show is trying to go for. Like, if the show is about these people acknowledging and working to fix the worst aspects of themselves, then why does Gideon still end up being evil? They portray it as if it's a good thing now because he's doing it for his girlfriend who thinks it's hot, but it really seems like Julie's the one with issues here, and Gideon needs to find someone to have a healthier relationship with. Then there's a character like Wallace. What he did to Todd was fucked up. Why does he get a happy ending where he finds true love without actually reflecting on how terribly he treated this guy? There's so much in here that just contradicts what the show is saying, which makes it feel incredibly clumsy in conveying the message it's trying to. So after not enjoying the way the show handles its themes, I had to ask myself if the show had anything else to offer, and the only other thing I could see people being interested in is the central hook revolving around this mystery of who kidnapped Scott and made it look like he died. So if that's what justifies the episodes leading up to the finale, then the main focus of the plot should be about solving this mystery, and the forward momentum of the story should come from Ramona investigating her 7 evil exes to see who's most likely to do this. However, that's not really what happens. Even calling what she does in the show an investigation is really misleading, considering she doesn't do any actual clue collecting or process of elimination that builds to a satisfying conclusion. A lot of the time, her way of getting information and eliminating suspects basically boils down to asking people, did you do it, and then instantly believing them when they say no. Whenever she crosses a name off of her list, she does so without any real evidence proving their innocence. It's infuriating, and it's also a big part of why these episodes feel so barren a lot of the time. Because Ramona barely engages in any genuine investigating, and because these episodes aren't even mostly about the drama between Ramona and her evil exes, most of the events that make up most of these episodes have to come from somewhere else, and they end up feeling like pointless distractions more often than not, since again, the central hook of the show is the burning question of what happened to Scott at the end of that first episode. For example, in episode 4, Ramona interrogates Lucas about her Scott case on 2 separate occasions, and both times she's interrupted by some inane bullshit about Wallace becoming an actor on the Scott Pilgrim movie, or the paparazzi coming in to fight with Lucas. The constant fights in the movies never felt this way because they were part of the main plot. The forward momentum of that story came from Scott making his way through each of Ramona's exes in order to reach the end goal of going out with her. And these distractions aren't necessarily a bad thing as long as they're interesting in their own right, but I honestly can't say that's the case for most of them. Let's take the Lucas Lee versus the paparazzi fight as an example. It looks impressive, but it goes on for so long and has so much dead space with no progression to the point where it honestly just feels like the anime is trying to stall for time and show off how polished it looks. The sequence also has a jarring sense of flow to it. Each shot that leads into the next feels so disconnected from the others, and I think that's because it really feels like Lucas is just teleporting from one location to the next. The appeal of a fight in a setting like this is the idea of moving from one film set to the next and using the different setups to incorporate some unique and energetic choreography. But without him actually crashing through walls, for example, and logically connecting each location to the next, that appeal is lost and all that's left is an impressive looking but shallow action sequence. Some fights have the opposite problem, where interesting things are happening, but the show never gives them a chance to breathe. The tension in these situations is always undercut by these overused jokes. For instance, when Ramona fights Wallace's stunt doubles, the show constantly cuts to Wallace making snarky remarks about the way they're fighting, which was okay at first, but then they just keep doing it over and over again. For fuck's sake, can we just watch a cool fight instead of consistently getting blue-balled right when it starts to get good? Even something like when Matthew was about to start fighting Scott in the first episode, just take a look at how the scene plays out. He crashes into the building and the two of them clash, but after that point, instead of instantly charging at Scott again, the show sends him into exposition mode to explain something that could have been told to us much more effectively. Then the show instantly goes into Ramona's history with the guy, and then when that's over, Matthew finally hypes himself up to attack, but instead of something actually happening and following through on all the buildup they were doing, Matthew fumbles his line, the music cuts out, and Scott needs to awkwardly finish his sentence for him. Just go in! My dick can't keep switching between hard and soft all the time. The movie's fights were also interrupted a lot, but the movie made sure to cap off each of the stages of those fights in a way that was memorable and made it clear that something was actually changing. The anime has some genuinely fun ideas, like in episode 6 when Gideon and Lucas start hanging out and acting all buddy-buddy, but the joke goes on for a bit too long. Like, I got the point after the first 3 shots of them doing stupid bullshit together. Do we really need to drag this out any further? These distractions that go on for much longer than necessary contribute to this really wonky pacing for most of the episodes. Like, the show is always meandering about and never has a clear focus in mind. It doesn't feel like there's any progress being made until the very last moments of these episodes, both in terms of the mystery and character elements of the show. The only exception to this is episode 3, when the show was most focused on introducing the true premise of the story and setting up the main source of intrigue. But even then, there's still some random bullshit like that weird and out of nowhere plot beat hinting at a connection between Gideon and Julie. Yada yada, you've heard it before. The movie is paced extremely well and always feels like it's constantly building to the next thing through clever transitions, dramatic line readings that are relevant to the next scene, and really effective writing that allows for the themes of the movie to coincide with the surface level plot of defeating Ramona's 7 evil exes. And that goal being focused on creates a natural feeling of progression, unlike in the anime where Ramona essentially makes all of her progress in solving the case at the end of the 6th episode, and that's only because she just happened to see the twins' robot at Julie's house for no reason. So it feels forced when she puts together all of the information that she gathered pretty much in this episode alone and comes to the conclusion that the Katayanagi twins were somehow involved. Also, when she goes into detail on the why portion of her reasoning, she fails to realize that the motive the twins had for doing something like this is a motive that could easily be assigned to any one of her exes, which wouldn't be a problem if she actually did her due diligence and found some evidence that proves that they had nothing to do with the situation. The use of the robot here is also really cheap, considering the show actively hides information from the viewers. This scene of Ramona playing back the footage of what happened in episode 1 straight up lies to you and shows you something that wasn't in the first episode. But none of that matters since Scott just shows up anyways to tell Ramona what's going on, completely obliterating any sense of purpose that the episodes leading up to this point had. When the show did that, I just felt like I wasted all of my time, like none of what happened mattered, because if Ramona just waited around for him, Scott would have just shown up to solve everything anyways. The only redeeming quality of the show comes from its final 2 episodes and the shape the story eventually decides to take. And these 2 episodes are just so much better paced than the rest of the show. They flowed nicely and it felt like there was some actual structure to how the show decided to tell its story here. The jokes got a lot better despite a couple of hiccups, and this whole thing they do with future Scott is just an interesting idea and a cool way to add on to Scott and Ramona's relationship. I did enjoy these episodes, and I feel like if the show had just been about this from the start, I would have been a lot more into it, but as it is now, I just wish the show got to the point a lot more quickly. Due to its less than stellar comedy, disconnected and jumbled feel to the story, and the surprisingly messy approach it takes to exploring its themes, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is a deeply flawed show that outside of its ending doesn't really have a solid grasp on how to do a lot of the things it tries to.